life ambition to know what it means to be a good disciple of Jesus. And how thankful we are that the Lord has preserved for us the Gospel of Mark. For in this Gospel we find a remarkable collection of followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus. And sometimes these disciples get it right, but more often than not, in the Gospel of Mark, they don't get it right because they're not very good disciples. And so we ask ourselves, well, which is it? Were the original 12 good disciples, or weren't they? And the answer is yes. They were sometimes good disciples, and they were sometimes not good disciples. Can I get a show of hands of the disciples in here tonight? You mean I'm the only one who sometimes is a good disciple and sometimes not? Because you know this is our story, which when we read the biblical story, if we read it from that angle and that vantage point, this is God's story, yes, to me. And this story tells us lots about ourselves that would otherwise not be known. And when our time came to a close last week, we were looking at, with much interest, how Jesus did a number of remarkable things. The disciples that answered the call, got up and followed him, had no background with him. He just was an itinerant. That is, he was just walking about. And on his walkabout, he would just stumble into people's lives, and when he stumbled into their lives, they would have an encounter with him. And some got up and followed him. That's just what they did. And then we watched throughout the story that Jesus seems to have a level of authority about him, which when people encountered him, certain responses occurred. Not the least of which was his capacity to heal, his capacity to cast evil from people, and many such things. All of which leads us to ask another question. Well, he can do all of those amazing things that we've been seeing so far, but can he teach? Is that not a fair question? Can he teach? Because if you know anything about the biblical tradition, teaching is highly, highly important. Our Jewish forefathers and foremothers, at least, were well known for their rabbis and for their prophets and for their teachers. Well, leaving little to the imagination, Jesus can teach, and we will discover that in chapter 4. Are you looking with me in that chapter? Realizing we're going to address a lot of things today in anticipation of next week. And in next week's lessons together, we're going to do chapters 11 through about 13, because chapter 13 will give us a bit more pause than maybe other chapters will, because chapter 13 in Mark's Gospel has to do with the question the disciples asked, Lord, is this the time you're about to bring the world to its end? Which most of you know is eschatology. And lots of people are really interested in that subject, so we'll spend a little bit more time on that one next week. But we've got to get there first by means of this path that he's taken us on, the Gospel of Mark has, one of which is Jesus is an authority in all these other ways, but is he an authoritative teacher? Well, chapter 4, verse 1 tells us, he began to teach beside the sea. A very large crowd gathered about him. So he got into a boat, sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd, was beside the sea on the land. So you've got the picture here. He pushes out from the shore just a little bit, sits in the boat, addresses the crowd. The wind lifting his voice as it would from the water would carry the sound to those gathered to listen. And verse 2 tells us, he taught them many things in parables. So there's an important biblical word, parables. Most of us grew up learning what a parable is. What is it? An earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Oh, that's nice. And that's not altogether incorrect. But the emphasis with the word parable should fall in another place. That is to say, we have only rightly read and heard a parable when it literally shocks the daylights out of us. All too often when we read or hear a parable, or when you learn that the pastor's going to be preaching a parable, most people long ago already decided they know what that's about. Little faith, big results, right? The parable of the mustard seed. So that most people can take a deep yawn on Sunday morning, kick back, and close their eyes, because they already know, right, the meaning of the parable. Well, that's altogether wrong when it comes to a true understanding of what the parable is. A parable is actually, it's a verbal encounter or a verbal assault on a reader or a hearer. And Jesus, let's be clear about it, they did not put Jesus on a cross and crucify him because he ran around telling cute little God stories. They put Jesus on a cross and crucified him because when he told a parable, it rocked their world. Well, are you ready to have your world rocked?
Yes.
Parable. Oh, really? Well, you're braver than I am. I don't want it, but listen, Jesus says in verse 3. A sower went out to sow. Now notice what he's doing. This is a more or less agrarian community, right? I drove in past the cotton fields and the other things that are out there. You know all about planting stuff and what have you. So there's a level of comfort. See how strategic Jesus is in setting the table, setting the stage for the parable that he's about to tell. And you know about farming the same way those folk in that day know about farming. So he's building a connection with the reader. But be very clear, always, whenever there's a parable being taught, and when we read it, it's a bit like standing on a rug when suddenly, unbeknownst to you, someone comes up from behind you and jerks it from under you. And when that happens, you end up what? Falling down, gasping for air because this thing has suddenly struck you in a way that it never could. Well, that's precisely what parables do. And this parable is going to do that to us if you will allow it to do its work on you. But if you already decided what it means, and you've already what? Taken a deep yawn and said, oh yeah, this is the parable about soil, and we all want to know about all those other people out there, right? What kind of soil are they? You know, that's what most people think. Well, brace yourselves. Some of this seed, we are told in verse 4, he sowed. Some fell along the path. Birds came and ate it up. Others fell on the rocky ground where it had not much soil. Immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. When the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Point being so far, most farmers in the crowd that day would have been chuckling. Why would they have been chuckling? Because this is a knucklehead farmer. Farmers in the New Testament world knew exactly where the rocks were beneath the soil. They were not about to what? Cast their valuable seed into the bushes or along the highway or other places. They were not about to do that. Jesus is being comical in his presentation so far, having won over the crowd who knows right much about farming anyway. Other seed, verse 7, he tells us, fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up, choked it, it yielded no grain. Verse 8, other seeds fell into the good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30, 60, 100 bushel yield. And he said, he or she who has ears to hear, what? Let him hear. That is to say, the nature of God's kingdom, and Jesus as its main proclaimer, is odd, it's unusual, and it's unpredictable. Who in the world would ever have imagined that Jesus would have wasted any seed in your life or mine? It isn't as if we were some fine catch that the world just could not live without if God had not planted in our lives a certain seed. I don't mean to damage your self-esteem tonight. It isn't as if God were in his heavens wringing his hands saying about Canoy, oh, I sure do hope Canoy will say yes when I come to it, because the world will be a dreadful place without it. Oh no, you know the rest of the biblical story. If we don't get it right, he said on one occasion in Luke's gospel, the rocks will what? They will cry out. I mean, he can do a whole lot better than we can. But the nature of God's kingdom is such that God's kingdom and God's sower just throws out the seed. Just throws it out there. And some falls here, and some falls here, and some falls here. And you, as the sower, you don't have a clue where that seed is actually going to what? Take root and produce anything. The good news is, for your evangelism, you're sharing the gospel with other people, don't sweat it. Don't worry about whether or not God is going to what? Produce a harvest in a person's life. Just do what? Just throw the seed out there. Because you never know whether this person is in fact what? Right soil or wrong soil. But what you do and what you must necessarily attend to with regard to this parable isn't whether or not in your sowing the seed someone else is or isn't good soil. What you and I must attend to is, what kind of soil am I? Every moment of every day, ask yourself the question when you get up in the morning. What kind of soil am I going to be today for God's Word, which I know because I'm one of His disciples, one of His followers? What kind of soil am I today in terms of what God can potentially produce and reproduce in my life? I discovered that when I get up every day and ask that question and ask myself repeatedly that question, some things I might find myself straying off into, I won't go there because I'm asking myself the question, what? Is this activity in which I'm about to engage, is it what? Is it going to produce something fertile in my life and in this world, or isn't it? Ask yourself that question. Because this parable is all about discipleship. What it means to be a disciple, a follower of Jesus. What kind of soil am I? Which means when you roll into church on Sunday morning, you're not troubled or worried about whether it's too warm or too cool in the sanctuary. The pew is too soft or too hard. Someone failed to or did not speak to you in a way that you prefer. Because all you're asking yourself is, and all you're saying when you walk into the doors of the church Sunday morning is what? Some good soil here. Good soil walking here. Good soil. And what does that mean? If I am good soil, God will do what? God will plant some seed in my life, somehow, some way, through someone else, something that's said, whatever. God will plant some seed in my life. And that seed is going to what? It's going to germinate. It's going to take root, and it's going to produce something in my life, as long as I'm what? Attending to what? What kind of soil am I? So what kind of soil are you? Because you see, never yet has God let us down when we come into His presence and we are self-identifying ourselves as what? Fertile ground. Fertile ground. Into which the music of the hour, into which the Sunday school Bible study lesson, into which any and everything that happens today, something good is going to come from it because I am attending to the soil. Got me? It's easy for us to, again, use a parable like this and to say that it refers to what? Other people. But this is a disciple book. What kind of disciple am I? What kind of soil am I? Well, he goes on. Verse 10, 11, 12, it's kind of a strange thing about what parables are. Listen to this. And when he was alone, those who were about him with the 12 asked him about the parables. He said to them, to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God. I've made it plain to you, he said. But for those outside, everything is in parables. In other words, it's as if everything that has to do with this gospel and this kingdom of God language, it is strange talk to people who don't understand it, for people who are not fertile ground. It's strange and odd language. That may surprise you, but it probably doesn't. Particularly when we get to chapter 8 and the disciples are wrestling again with what it means to follow Jesus and who is this Jesus that we're called to follow. And Jesus asked the question, who do men say that I am? And they start spouting out, John the Baptist, etc., all these other people. But who do you say that I am? And Peter volunteers, you are the what? You are the Christ. Well, he's exactly right, except his what? His definition is altogether wrong. And then Jesus says, let me tell you the kind of Messiah I'm going to be. I'm going to a cross by way of Jerusalem, and the Jewish leaders and the Roman officials are going to reject me. And Peter nearly has a coronary, because he cannot imagine that his Lord is what? Is going to die. It's a parable. Jesus' very life is a parable. He does things that are strange and odd and unusual. And when you have predetermined what he has to be, as Peter had, and other disciples had as well, if you predetermine that, then when Jesus does something that strays outside the boundaries of what he thought was the case, you got a problem. Everything's a parable. Which means you have to look with a different lens and with a different eye and have different kinds of soil in your life in order to understand who Jesus is and what you're to be about and I'm to be about in this world. He says other things. So look with me at verses 13 and following, because now he needs to break down what he's talking about. He said to them, do you not understand this parable? Now, who's this question to? It isn't really to that audience back then. The question is to me. I got this? Yeah, the disciples. I'm one of the disciples. Do you understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word. These are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word which is sown in them. Now, there are moments in our lives, guess what? When the amazing and awesome word that is planted in our lives, it's easy enough for the evil one to do what? Come in and pluck that up from your life and my life, unless you and I are ever on guard against what? Such a thing happening. And it is an easy task for him. Do I speak like an expert on this subject? Of course I am. He knows us and knows our very weaknesses, yours and mine, and he is master at it, has been at it quite a long time. And we are powerless against him, short of God assisting us and us taking account and giving stock to the kind of soil we are going to be. So that when that seed, that truth, whatever it is that hits our lives, that bumps up against other things that are of importance and value to us, unless we're really on guard, it'll just be a passing thought. And we'll just move on and forget whatever it was that had come to us with such power and authority in our lives. Satan can do this. 16. And these in like manner are the ones sown upon the rocky ground, who when they hear the word, immediately, there's that word again, receive it with joy. You understand about this? And they have no root in them, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. Point being, you become a Christian, get ready. What's coming? Persecution, struggle, tribulation, trouble is coming. The Christian life is not an easy life. It's a difficult road. It's a challenging road. Jesus uses another image, parabolic image, in Matthew's gospel. He talks about a narrow way, doesn't he? He talks about a wide way. And the more proper translation of that word, and the narrow way that leads to life is the afflicting way. The afflicting way. You understand what that means? That means it's not easy. It's not easy. In fact, the afflicting way that he is there describing can be likened unto the narrow way. That's another word that is used in association with that concept. It's a narrow way. Well, what is this narrow way? Well, it's not complicated. It's walking right down the middle. And that doesn't mean you can't make up your mind. What it means is, let's get political for a moment. What it means is, you're not conservative enough and you're not liberal enough. You're just walking where? Right down the middle, where the left shoots at you and the right shoots at you. And each one is accusing you of what? Not coming their way. Don't you just love it when the group tells you how you're supposed to think? Don't you just love it when the political parties tell you, if you're going to be one of us, you're going to have to what? You're going to have to do this or do that. And we Christians, Jesus says, because you see, he was not nearly liberal enough for the Pharisees, and nor was he nearly conservative enough for the Sadducees. And both groups, guess what? Plotted together to get rid of him. You want to know when you're walking the narrow way? When they're shooting at you from the left and the right. Is that a happy existence? It's a meaningful existence, but it isn't an easy one. You hear me? It's a meaningful existence, but it is not an easy one. When you're not liberal enough and you're not conservative enough. And somebody says, well, which party do you vote? You say, I vote with the Jesus party. That's the one that walks where? Right down the middle. Gets shot at left and right. Well, that's Matthew's gospel. That's for another study. But it's altogether connected to what Jesus is saying here in terms of what happens in our lives. That this seed that drops into our fertile ground, well, guess what's going to happen? Tough times are coming. Difficult challenges await all of us. This isn't an easy existence. For a long time in America, and in the American South, more so than in other places right now, being a Christian meant you were pretty much in the culture's favor. But guess what? Not anymore. You're out of favor with the culture in most circles if you, in fact, stand for anything. Persecutions, tribulations come. It's what it means to be a disciple. Immediately, verse 17, last part of it says, they did what? They fall away. Have we ever fallen away? Yeah, it happens. Others, he says, are the ones sown among the thorns. They're those who hear the word, the cares of the world, the delight in wealth or riches. That's not our problem, is it? Don't tell anybody, that's not our problem. We're not in trouble. We don't worry about the market. We don't worry about our 401ks. We don't worry about those things, do we? Okay. I'm talking to myself. You just listen in. And the desire for other things. Enter in and choke the word. I wish I could say that I never was troubled about anything else. That I was just always walking around spouting off to God about what good soil I am. But I know what happens. Other things in life do what? They circle in on me. I turned 61 the other day. You know, I got a little notice from the university saying, retirement's coming. What? Am I ready for that? How dare them remind me of this? But you understand the point. It's like you've got to be responsible. You know, all of this stuff is there. And the care settles in on us. And they can end up choking what? Choking the life out of me. You're exactly right. I can become so preoccupied. I checked my stock market thing 4 times a day. Now, that changed everything, didn't it? That fixed it. I ought not even to have looked at it. But I did. Why am I worried about these things? You see what happens? It just creeps up on us, doesn't it? And before you know it, we can become so distracted by those things that the good things we could have been doing were what? We're preoccupied in other ways. So that it enters in, it chokes the word, it proves unfruitful. But those that were sown upon the good ground, verse 20, good soil, are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30, 60, 100-fold. So the takeaway for the evening, among others that I hope you'll take away is, ask yourself many times a day, what kind of soil am I? Am I really hearing what you really want to say to me today, Lord? Or am I easily, as most of us are, distracted by any number of these other things that happen? And they do happen. The balance of the parables just continue to emphasize Jesus' capacity and Jesus' authority to teach. And the crowds are astounded at his capacities to teach. So you would have expected the disciples, us, being good soil, to have received his word and to live happily ever after. Well, that is until what happens, like what happens in verse 35. On that very same day, when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to the other side. Now, you know from the background last week, or you should know at least, the moment Jesus says, let's go across to the other side, the disciples are wide-eyed and mouths agape. Go where? I mean, that would be like telling the Clemson players, let's go down to Bourbon Street, or whatever. Oh, go. Overrated. Let's go where? Let's go down into Bayou. No. It's like we are not going over there, because this gospel is all about what? Paying attention to which side of the lake Jesus does whatever Jesus does. It's probably just me.
He keep using this for you.
Or I can just move left or move right.
If you just stand still, I'll fix it.
Oh dear, I am not a singer, so I don't really know what to do with this one. So we're going to just keep talking while he fixes me here. All right. Make me sound better. Anyway, so we're going to go across to the other side, and the disciples are rightly disturbed by the prospect of going where? To the other side. And sometimes in our lives we have to be aware of what the other side is and what potentially awaits us on the other side. So we're told in verse 36, leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. All right? So you probably have heard this story many times, haven't you? That in life there are what? There are storms in life. Yeah, and that's not an unimportant point to be made. But you maybe have never paid careful attention to this story, because I want you to look seriously at this story with me. Who was it that sent them there? Who sent them into the storm? Who? You don't say. Jesus did what? Jesus sent them into the storm. Now, if I've heard a sermon on this one, if I've heard 99 of 100 sermons on this one, 99 of the 100 that I've heard on this one, guess what? It's all about telling you that when the storms in life come, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, did you know that Jesus will sometimes take you into the storm? Because we are disciples, remember? And life is sometimes a storm. And Jesus has great confidence in us, his disciples, that when we go into the storm, that what? We will trust. We will believe. He has great confidence in us. And you know what happens when we go into the storm, don't you? If we allow God to help us in the storm, it equips us for what? The next one is coming. Again, newsflash, and most of you are old enough in this room to appreciate this. Life is not easy. It is full of heartbreak, heartache, and disappointment. And you don't live very long, but when you discover this, and those who would tell you otherwise are living some kind of other self-denial or denial about how real life is. And Jesus understands that life is tough. His own life was difficult. But at any rate, they're in the boat. Other boats are with them. And verse 37 says, and a great storm of wind arose, and waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. 38. But when he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, they awakened him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and, what's the word? Rebuked the wind. It's the same word here that Jesus used to rebuke the demon in the man when the man was speaking in the synagogue. Guess what? It's the very same word that Jesus is going to use when Simon Peter says, you're the Christ. We're going to hear, and Jesus rebuked him. Say, what? Jesus rebuked Peter for calling him the Christ? Yes, because Peter's understanding of the Christ was a misunderstanding. No self-respecting Messiah that he was going to follow was going to a cross and die. No. He had already predetermined what? What the Messiah must be like. And Jesus comes and rocks that world. Teacher, do you care that we're perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, I think I mentioned this last week. What did he say to the sea?
Shut up.
Right. But our English translations say,
Peace be still.
Jesus says, peace be still. Nonsense. Jesus says, shut up. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, why are you afraid? Have you no what? Faith? And they were filled with what? Awe or fear, and said to one another, who in the world is this that even the winds obey? In other words, for all that they have seen, they still are yet what? Struggling with who this Jesus is. They don't understand necessarily what he's about. And if you and I are already understanding what he's about, it is for one reason. What kind of soil are we? We've been listening to his word, not our what? Our wants in terms of what he says. We are rather listening to his word, letting his word be our guide, not our wants and our wishes, because our wants and wishes always end up what? At cross purposes, or often they do with others. But the story really doesn't end there. And our chapter and verse divisions, unfortunately, don't do us much service. Now, they're important because you don't want Philip to say, turn over in your Bible somewhere about third way over there, and we're going to start reading. We need some what? We need some numbers, but please be aware that chapter and verse divisions were not in the originals. They were not there. In fact, the chapter and verse divisions that we use today are only as old as the 1700s. A particular Frenchman by the name of Roberto Estienne actually has given us the chapter and verse divisions that are in our English translations today. And most scholars, when reading the New Testament in the Greek language at least, said he must have done so while riding on a horse. And every time the horse bobbled, he must have said, let's put one here, because they don't necessarily what? They don't necessarily help us. In fact, they sometimes disconnect important pieces of the story that ought to be hung together, because we're told in chapter 5, verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea. Now, most of you, if you're doing your daily Bible reading, what are you going to do? You're going to read a few chapters a day, cut off the reading, and then jump in tomorrow, and not always what? Keep the story connected, which is why I ask you as your homework assignment to do what? Read the gospel in its entirety as best you can in a single sitting. And when you do that, things that have been said before, easily are connected to things that we're now reading. Well, he came to the other side of the sea. I mean, I had little doubt that when they're going to the other side, they will hardly have gotten out into the water, but what's going to happen? Where are they going anyway? They're going over there where the pagans live, and as a welcome warning, what happens? The storm is crashing on the sea, such that Jesus has to stand up and give command to it to hush up. So they get to the other side, to the country of the Gerasenes, Gadarenes, whatever your translations say. We're not really sure which is the proper word here. Verse 2. And when he had come out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs, of course they did, a man with an unclean spirit. Well, yeah, because we're where? We have just made landfall down in the bayou. Okay, Clemson fans. We've made landfall. Now we're looking around and we're expecting to see nothing but what? Exactly what we find here. In this case, as the story goes on, we got a chain-breaking crazy man here that meets them. He lived among the tombs, we're told, verse 3. No one could bind him anymore, even with a chain. He had often been bound with bonds and chains. The chains he would wrench apart. The bonds he broke into pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out, bruising himself with stones. Verse 6. And when Jesus saw him at a distance, the man ran and worshipped him. Sounds good so far, doesn't it? Except watch what happens. 7. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Well, that's like what? I mean, he's got it down pretty good, doesn't he? I mean, has he rightly identified Jesus? Yes. But notice what the man has done. He has what? He has called Jesus by name. He has rightly identified Jesus' qualities and characteristics. He's done all of this. And with this in mind, you have to reach back in your biblical memory to what's up with this man calling Jesus by name. Remember the first person to name someone in the Bible? When you go way back to the Genesis story? Yeah, God gave Adam a job, didn't he? And Adam's job was to do what? Name them. Turn this hippopotamus, turn this rhinoceros, name them. And in naming someone, the same way when you named your children and or your parents named you, the one doing the naming has what? Authority over that which is being named. And in this story here, while it isn't as apparent to us as it could be on the surface, in this story here, this man coming up to Jesus and calling him by name and by title and the like, it's a power play. If he names Jesus, he owns him to a degree. I adjure you by God, he commands Jesus, do not torment me. Interesting. Verse 8. But he said to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, what's your name? You see the name thing? What's your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. In other words, you can't just give me a single name. There are 1,000 of us. Power play going on. He begged them eagerly, verse 10, not to send them out of the country. Verse 11. Now a great herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, send us to the swine, let us enter them. 13. So he gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out, entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the what? Into the sea, the lake, and were drowned in the sea. Now, I hope you are appreciating what's happening here, and it requires a bit of biblical geography on our part. So where does Jesus send these legion of demons? Into the swine, and then where? Into the depth of the sea. Now you do realize, don't you, that the Jewish people, God's people, were not a seafaring people. They rarely went into the waters, except to do a bit of fishing. They stayed out of the big water. They knew the Jonah story. They knew what? They knew what was out there in the great deep. And if you know anything about biblical geography, you also know that the great deep is also the abode of chaos and darkness and evil. My translation, Jesus sent those bad boys home. You get it? They came from the demon-possessed man, and they went where? They returned to the evil from whence they had come. The book of Revelation says lots about that in chapter 9. There's a pit of the abyss that what? The lid gets opened, and out from it comes what? All of those clouds of darkness. I'm setting you up for that study we're going to do 20 years from now, whenever we do it. It's like Pandora's box. You're familiar with Pandora's box? Don't open that lid. Don't you open that lid, because when you what? Once you open the lid, you can never what? You can't shut it back. And guess what we did a long time ago, along with Adam and Eve? We opened the lid. And we've been living what? We've been living with that ever since, and we've been trying our darndest to what? Shut that lid back down. But once it's opened, it cannot be shut back down again. Only Jesus can what? Send that evil back to the place from whence it came. Aren't we glad? Hallelujah, right? Yeah. Amen. Thank God that He can do these things. Well, in the story, of course, the herdsmen get all upset about this because, Jesus has messed with their economy and the like. But I want you to watch the response of this man in comparison to our disciples who don't have faith yet, never mind that they've seen all these things take place. Watch verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. Now that sounds like what it means to be a good disciple. To do what? Let's just follow Jesus. Let's go with Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. Verse 19. But he refused. That's Jesus. And said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how He has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the 10 cities, that's the Decapolis, how much Jesus had done for him. And all men marveled. So you can be sure this fellow is a real disciple. Jesus says do something, and what? He did it. Spot on did it. Never mind the fact that you and I would have said, no, wait, Jesus, I got a lot to learn yet. Let me what? Let me go with you. But Jesus knows better what we should be doing with our lives than we what? Might know ourselves. So the question is, are we going to trust Him? Are we going to be what kind of soil? You see, perfect example of what? This man was good soil, into which that word, Jesus' word came. Proof positive is that he what? He responded and did exactly what Jesus told him to do. 3 cheers for the man. We've done the next story of the woman with the issue of blood and her, the other young woman associated with that. But I want you to see in this, again, this soil illustration, which prompts me to have to jump a few chapters here to chapter 7, verse 24 to 30. Lots of things, of course, happen in the meantime between chapter 5 and what we're coming to in chapter 7, all related to this soil image. What kind of soil are we? The demon-possessed man, this encounter that he has with Jesus, he becomes good soil. Is a good disciple, a good follower, obedient follower of Jesus. And we come to verse 24 and we meet with a woman. Let's check her out. And from there, verse 24 says, he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, some translations say. Now, this is a place far north. This is as far north as Jesus ever goes in his ministry. He's actually leaving what would be the proper region of Israel that would be his area. He's going up to a coastal village that's known for its paganism. This is where he's going, all right? And he entered a house, second half, verse 24. And he, did not want anyone to know it, but he could not be kept secret or hidden. 25. Immediately, there's that word again. How many times? Terry, 30? How many?
37.
41.
37, 41. I mean, there are just tons of immediately. Click, 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 just pop, pop, pop. So immediately a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Greek, Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. In other words, no Jewish connection. She's a bona fide pagan. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, I wanted to tell you the story because Jesus is going to say something to this woman that shocks people. What does he say to her? In a parable, verse 27, let the children first be fed. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the what? Dogs. To the dogs. Translation? Lady, you're a dog. You didn't even want to say it, did you? You just can't make yourself what? Be honest with the Bible that contains this story that Jesus what? He just flat out called the woman a dog. Does that hurt your feelings? Does it shock you? Does it disappoint you? Well, if it shocks you or disappoints you, that yet again reflects how little we really understand what Jesus is about and what Jesus is doing and why Jesus chooses to do it. I mean, I read all of the scholarly materials on these things, and there are right many people that say, Jesus could never say something like that. This just doesn't fit. Da, 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 da. And then they unpack all of their fine, fancy reasons for saying such. Which again, just prompts me to say, you're just not getting it, are you here? You're not understanding what Jesus is doing here. Point being, Jesus knows full well what to say to whom, when, and how. And guess what? He does not always say the same thing to everybody. You've even said it about yourself, probably, that sometimes in your life, as I have often heard it said, sometimes God needs to take a 2x4 to me. Now, what do we mean? That sometimes we can be so stubborn that we need what? We need a level of intervention. We need a level of what? Intrusion into our lives. We need something to get our attention that ordinary soft talk might not do. Well, in this case, can we not give Jesus the benefit of the doubt? That he knows exactly what he needs to say to this woman. In fact, he casts what he says to her in terms of a riddle. So, he says to her, it is a right to give to the children that which belongs to the dogs. Or rather, not children must first be fed, not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, yes, Lord. Now, you might say, well, if he'd spoken to me like that, I'd have said what? See you later, dude. You're not what I thought you were. Which would be to say what? I know better what I need than what? Than you, Jesus, know what I need. Jesus can be direct. He can be blunt. He can be harsh. He can be whatever he needs to be. For what purpose? To get the point across to us, which is different for every person. And in this case, he knew precisely what this woman needed to hear. And she was not off-put by what he said for a moment. In fact, she snaps back with an immediate correct response in a way that makes the disciples blush. They would have wished they could have what? I mean, I can almost hear the disciples say, oh, he didn't say that. Because some people are so quick to weigh into this rather than to allow the story to do what the story's doing. She answered, yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs, the little dogs under the table, eat the little children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this word, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Point being, Jesus knows and is ever asking the question of us, what kind of soil am I? Will I hear what he says? Will I believe what he says? And when I hear and believe what he says, will it be evident in my life? And that's the challenge of what it means to be a disciple, one who follows Jesus. Now, this image that he uses of this ripe soil here, it carries forward in our closing story tonight in chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, and then something that I've been echoing from the time we began. So at verse 22, we have the story of the healing of a blind man at Bethsaida. So they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. Now, to this point in the story, Jesus has not healed a blind man. He's healed other kinds of things. People done other kinds of things. Hasn't healed a blind man yet. But you have to ask yourself the right question in this story as we've been following the story. And as I guess I just have to back up just briefly. Look at verse 14 in setting this up. We are told in verse 14, they had forgotten to bring bread. Now, their having forgotten to bring bread is connected to Jesus having fed 5,000, giving the commission to the disciples, go out there and what? Feed them. And they say, we don't have what? We don't have enough bread to feed even a handful of people, let alone 5,000. And Jesus orders the people to sit down, and he what? Takes the few loaves of bread and a few fish and feeds what? 5,000. Well, no sooner has he done that the disciples are in the boat, but they forgot to bring some bread. All right? And they only had one loaf of bread with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod. They discussed with one another what all this means. Jesus says in verse 18, having eyes, don't you see? Having ears, don't you hear? Don't you remember when I broke 5 loaves for the 5,000? In other words, why are you worrying about what? Whether or not there's going to be anything for you to eat when I just what? Fed 5,000 and you've got a loaf of bread here. In other words, disciples, are you what? Are you good soil? Are you getting this? Are you understanding the truths that I'm communicating here? Or are you not? And he said to them, verse 21, do you still not understand? Now they got what? They got 20/20 vision. They're seeing Jesus do everything. And then verse 22 tells us, it came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man. Now when I'm reading this, I'm saying, duh, he's got 12 walking around with him. Because they what? They're saying everything. And yet, we got no bread. What are we going to do, Jesus? We got no bread. There's a tithing, undoubtedly story in that. A giving story in this. What are we going to do? We can't make the budget. We don't have enough money. And Jesus says, what? What? I've already what? I put it in your hands. There's plenty here. I'll take care of this. You just what? Just do your part. Just do your part. Did you make the budget last year? Oh, we put you on the spot. Did you? You didn't? Well, why not? You didn't put me up to this. I just pulling this out of the air. I'm the guest. I'm gone in a couple weeks. That could be burned. He's out of here anyway. Well, what is Jesus saying here? I got this. Are you going to what? You going to get in this with me, or are you going to just be what kind of soil? Oh, that's right. We're too concerned about the cares and the riches of the world. There are more important things that we should be spending our money on than meeting the... Okay. Anyway, I'll just finish this without you looking at me. So here's this blind man. They bring to him. Verse 23, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he spit on his eyes and laid his hands upon him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, well, I see men, but they look like trees walking. You get that? Now, first time I read this story, reading it differently than I have come to understand how to read the Bible, I'm going, oh no. Jesus blew the healing. He what? He spit on the guy's eyes, and the guy just, he got a little of it, but he what? Because people look like what? In other words, he can see how? He can only see blurrily now in a way that before he couldn't see at all. And I'm going, Jesus, well, no. But what Jesus does is a parable. It's a parable on discipleship. That our lives are really and truly the story of God touching us and letting us see a little bit. And then guess what? Depending on the kind of soul we are, we will see what? We will see more next time than we saw last time. When what? When we're attending to the kind of soul that we are. Because as the story goes on, again, verse 25 says, he laid his hands on the man's eyes. So in other words, one time didn't do it. Well, it did do it, but Jesus intentionally does what? Touches the man and gradually brings sight to him as a parable, an acted parable of the gradual sight that he's bringing in your life and mine when we what? When we're the proper kind of soil into which his word has come. And he looked intently and was restored and saw everything clearly. And he sent this man away to his home saying, what? Don't even go into town. Why? Because he knows when the man goes into town, people are going to come running. What? This guy was blind, but now he sees. And where's Jesus? We want to go get our what? Our miracle. But Jesus says, when I'm doing these miracles, what happens? People sometimes confuse the sign with the signified. They confuse the sign with the signified. What was the point of the sign, you see? The point of the sign is there are plenty of people who will never see the light of day. But guess what? They see all things clearly. In a way that some people, what? With 20/20 vision. Can't see the truth of God for anything in their lives. Because they're not what? They're not the kind of soil. So, what kind of soil are you? A little bit of good soil in here. Just a little bit, just a little bit. So between now and next week, you're going to keep reading this, aren't you? And discovering the good soul that you are, because, you know, the next stories coming up are about Simon Peter just muffing it, blowing it, doesn't get it right. Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me or whatever. He's still not good soil. So be patient with yourself, because sometimes in life's story, we get to be better soil than we are at other times, but God is patient and God is kind with us. Aren't we glad? For which reason, while we are not what we were yesterday, we are not yet what we're going to be. We're still in the what? Still in the journey, still in the hunt. So Lord, walk with us, please, as we leave this place. Help us to be good soil, to become increasingly better and better disciples of yours, walking that narrow path, realizing that life is difficult and full of challenges, but also full of great hope and joy. And we will thank you. Anything good that comes from our lives will come because you have placed your seed into our lives and have changed us to become different than we otherwise would be. And we thank you for hearing our prayer and for walking with us. In the good name of Jesus. And all God's people said, Amen. Good night.